Welcome back to Press Review in Depth. Syrians living in Lebanon yesterday clamoured to the polls to vote in the Syrian presidential election. Meanwhile, in Egypt, preliminary results show that Sisi gained a 90% majority following 3 days of voting. Let's see what the press is saying. Patrick Kingsley reports for The Guardian from Cairo that Sisi has swung to victory. The article says Abdel Fattah al-Sisi will be Egypt's next head of state after winning well over 90% of the vote in the presidential elections, according to preliminary figures that gave him a larger electoral mandate than any other Egyptian politician since 2011 revolution. As few as 3.5% voted for his single opponent, the Labour activist Hamdeen Sabahi. The article says the turnout of 46% could only be achieved after officials announced a last-minute holiday, extended voting to a third day, and threatened non-voters with a large fine. The article adds, yet statistically, Sisi's victory was a strong one, dwarfing the 13 million who voted in 2012 for Mohamed Morsi, the man Sisi ousted from office last summer. Whether from fear or affection, many have demonstrably placed their trust in a strong man, who they hope can stabilise Egypt after 3 years of post-revolutionary unrest. The article says the head of one of Egypt's only homegrown pollsters, Basira, said the figures seemed plausible in the context of his company's exit polls. Apparently, the Sabahi campaign claimed that dozens of its activists were arrested after challenging alleged violations at polling stations across the country. Another Sabahi activist, Ayman Zakaria, circulated an image of his beaten torso, the result of an alleged police assault. The article concludes the efforts the state took to encourage people to vote suggest Sisi's popularity is not as universal as his supporters maintain. A small boycott by Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood and secular activists may have dented turnout, as has widespread apathy from voters bored by Egypt's 7th election since the 2011 uprising. And Ruth Sherlock reports from Lebanon for The Telegraph, saying expat Syrians joined the crush to support Assad in a parody election. She writes, thousands of Syrians desperate to vote for Bashar al-Assad swamped the embassy in Lebanon on Wednesday, taking part in a chaotic voting day for expatriates in an election described by the West as a parody of democracy. The article adds presidential elections are set to take place in Syria on June the 3rd, with Mr Assad running against Hassan al-Nouri or Mahir al-Hajjar, two little-known MPs who are not thought to have a chance of winning. Sherlock adds only people who crossed to Lebanon using an official border post were eligible to vote, automatically disqualifying tens of thousands who fled informally across Syria's porous border. Inside the embassy, voters pushed and jostled around 4 ballot boxes and voted publicly. At times, election workers were seen grabbing the ballots and stuffing them inside the boxes themselves. The article concludes there was also strong support for Mr Assad among the crowd, and at times the atmosphere was more of a pro-regime rally than an election. Men and women periodically broke into the chant of "With our souls, with our blood, we sacrifice for you, O Bashar." We're now joined by political analyst and journalist Carol Marlouf, who is live from Cairo. Thank you for joining us again, Carol, on Press Review.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, what are people in Cairo saying about the preliminary results of this election?
Well, it comes as quite expected that al-Sisi would win those elections. Nobody really took Hamdeen Sabahi, his opponent, to be a serious candidate in those elections. However, as you had mentioned earlier, that the turnout was quite low. Al-Sisi was expecting a very high turnout, but people from both sides of the spectrum have different interpretations. If you speak to the pro-Sisi camp, they consider the numbers to be good, that they were not expecting a much higher turnout, and they also blame the campaign, the Abdel Fattah Sisi campaign managers, to have not done enough in terms of mobilizing people on the ground. However, if you speak to the opponents of Sisi, there's a lot of talk about, having Sisi hijack the revolution, that he stood with the clamoured and the opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood back on June 30th of last year, pledging not to run for elections. But then, the military always takes precedent in this country, and we see him overstepping every other opponent and having cracked down on most of the opposition, whether it was the Muslim Brotherhood by naming them as a terrorist outlawed organization, or on the more secular front, which is the April 6 movement. The opponents are not happy with his previous performance and the crackdown, and them abstaining from going to the polls to vote for Sisi was quite significant in the numbers we saw yesterday.
And what do you think this now means for Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood and for Sisi's opponent, Sabahi?
Well, I think there is something that the Muslim Brotherhood are trying at the grassroots level to mobilize. We see every day small demonstrations in small neighborhoods here and there, nothing really on a mass scale. Sabahi, for him, he ran a democratic campaign. But if you look at the Egyptian military owns or runs 40% of the Egyptian economy. They run bakeries, bottling water. They have monopoly over wheat import to the country. They employ millions in the armed forces. So they are quite well established within the Egyptian state. However, people have seen that this election has been an alliance between the strong military establishment and the former businessmen who were benefiting from the Mubarak era. So this is why there is resentment. There is a lot of talk about going back to the Mubarak era, as if the January 25 revolution actually didn't succeed in bringing any change, and that the military first went into an alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood, then cracked down on them. They went again in an alliance with the more secular members of the opposition on last year on the June 30th movement, and they again cracked down on them over the past year. So there are three elements here to look at when you look at the current Egyptian situation. There are the businessmen, the businessmen who were strong during the Mubarak era, were totally sidelined by the Muslim Brotherhood, and now they're back. There is the military, who is really strong in terms of on the political and economic level, plus, of course, the security, which was a major concern over the past year. And now you have the grassroots opposition, whom we have to look and monitor closely to see how they will react in the next year also.
Yeah, and regarding the economy, obviously issues that matter to ordinary Egyptians like energy prices. What do you think Sisi and his new government will do about to tackle these issues that are important to Egyptians?
Exactly, that's an excellent question, because it goes back to this partnership between the private sector and the public sector. You see, Egypt has a very big government. It employs around 7 or 8 million people, most of which I think are, they don't do anything. They just registered as government employees. So what Sisi is planning to do is lift certain subsidies and make it a smaller government. But in order to be able to do that, he needs to bring the private sector, and those businessmen to the game, so that they would then invest in other sectors, so that he could bring a balance. So while it is true that he might lift certain subsidies and prices might go up, for example, on fuel, for certain people. This usually targets more the middle classes because fuel prices are usually they target people with cars and with modes of transportation and with more electricity and who have a higher expenditure. So if that targets the middle classes, then what he needs to do at this point is to bring those former businessmen in the game so that he could create a certain balance between the private sector and the public sector. Because with the way things are going now, the Egyptian government cannot sustain that amount of expenditure in terms of employees or government-owned projects. So they either look into privatizing some projects or into attracting more foreign direct investment in terms of PPP projects. So we have to see there has been a lot of talk about development and reform in the telecom industry, in the electricity, in the in a lot of infrastructure projects, low-income housing. But we have to wait.
I just have to cut you short.
Whom he will name as Prime Minister.
Yeah. Thanks, Carol. I just have to cut you short there because we're pressed for time. Just quickly, regarding yesterday's Syrian presidential elections in Lebanon, what can you tell us about that? What was the mood like on the ground in Lebanon?
Well, Lebanon, as you know, is a friendly neighboring country of Syria with the presence of Hezbollah. So not all refugees or the Syrian residents in Lebanon are anti-Bashar. There are a lot who live under the opposition, and they fled to Lebanon. And that's what we've seen yesterday on the street.
Thank you, Carol, for joining us. And that was Carol Marlouf, political analyst. For more updates, please visit levant.tv. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.